Well, there I was, having my morning heaping tall glass of fresh white milk, wearing my MAGA hat, and making the OK sign, and, generally just being a white person the other day, when I came across this video, which, obviously, so offended my whiteness that I decided not only did I need to respond to it, but that we need to have a little bit of a talk about language use, and how it can be utilized to persuade and manipulate people fairly simply. Particularly because the video in question is designed to be used by teachers to educate 14 to 16-year-old students in the United Kingdom. That means, yes, my friends, this is intended as educational. Oh, and lads, if you know me, nothing boils my bottom more than an attempt at indoctrinating the childers. So, here we have this debate series that, interestingly enough, doesn't allow for comments in the comments section. Yeah, that really represents the values of your moniker of don't hate the debate, now doesn't it? Not allowing comments. That really represents the values of everything you're supposed to be spreading here. Spreading spurious information about multiculturalism, and essentially redefining invasion as immigration. Thus today, let's take a look at the importance of language in persuasion, from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in particular. The effects of sophistry and labeling, ultimate terminology, symbology, connotation versus denotation, and various other theories of language in connection to persuasion, such as reinforcement intensity, information processing, and communication accommodation. Basically, this is sort of an overview of language that we're going to be covering, but I think it's important, and I will get into some of the more current political debate as well, because we can see this stuff far outside of the media. So what do we have here? We have a video from BBC Teach. That means, of course, that this piece of utter propaganda is paid for by the British people. But not only is it paid for by them, it is intended for use by high school teachers as an exemplar of a debate, of an intellectual debate, to play for students. The video begins with the premise that immigration to the British Isles is not a new thing, and lists off a number of tribes, cultures, and groups that have at one point or another inhabited the land.
Think immigration's a recent thing? Think again. Because you see, you've got the Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, the Normans, the Flemish, the Irish, Black Britons, and Jewish people. Yep, we were multicultural long before curry and carnival.
First of all, while the land has been inhabited by humanity's ancestors, by some estimates, as far back as 900,000 years, we should probably pay a little bit more attention when we're talking about this migration theory to more recent genetic and historical records, right? Fossil records such as the 7,000-year-old Cheddar Man, who, just saying, even one of the scientists who helped create this reconstruction of what he probably looked like, isn't completely convinced of the race or skin color that this man was. But what's interesting is that the Cheddar Man's DNA is most similar, or most predominantly found, in what are modern-day Estonians, Suomi, and Sami people. Further forward in time, beaker culture and archaeological evidence indicate a migration from across Western and Central Europe that also appears pretty prevalent across the British Isles, with evidence of inhabitants with a similar pottery and metallurgical techniques of those that were found around those in the Iberian Peninsula, and those found across Central Europe as far back as 2000 BC. But the first and probably greatest real move that we can indicate towards what we now call the UK, and that we can nail down to a specific group, was the migration of the Gaelic and Celtic peoples from Western and Central Europe, which is believed to have occurred starting around the 6th century BC. Around the turn of the BC to the AD, though, of course, Rome began to conquer Britain, and absorbed much of her land into the empire, contributing not only to the country's infrastructure through the building of forts, aqueducts, and municipal buildings, but also probably unquestionably given a lot of Celtic lasses some of that Roman D.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? Brought peace? Oh, peace! Shut up!
By the way, Italy will never subjugate Cumbria again. Anyway, following the decline and fall of Rome and her influence over the Isles came the invasion of what we now call the Anglo-Saxons, various Germanic tribes and cultures, including, well, obviously the Angles, Saxons, and less obviously, the Jutes and any other number of at least 35 different Germanic tribes during the post-Roman period.
Then the Saxons came.
such as the Frisians, whose modern-day language is still somewhat mutually intelligible with current English. The continual invasions did not stop there, though. After hundreds of years of conflict between the tribes, these various different Germanic tribes that is, which predominantly conquered the Celt population, began the invasion of a new group, that being the Danes from, well, unsurprisingly, modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. That began around 700 AD. Despite unification under a single Anglo-Saxon king near the turn of the first millennia, the invasion and conquer of Britain from mainland conquerors would continue with the Normans under the command of William the Conqueror, with the migration of thousands of French people, or what would be modern-day France, to the islands. The Norman invasion was the last major migratory period in British history up until the modern age, though, in large part due to the fact that the British Empire began to control lots of foreign regions, predominantly areas like India. But what is traditionally considered British, Irish, Welsh, and Scottish, in other words part of the UK, has remained more or less relatively unchanged since around 1200 to 1300 AD. Let's take a look at some of the claims made in this video in more detail then.
It's in our DNA. There's no such thing as a pure Brit. Despite what some flag wavers would have you believe, the average one is just 36% Anglo-Saxon. Migration did step up after the Second World War, when people arrived from all over the colonies, places like India, the Caribbean, Pakistan, Uganda, and Kenya.
First, they refer to all of these groups and their movement to the UK as migration or immigration. And well, that's not quite accurate, now is it, given what I've just described? Most of these group so-called migrations were not migrations, were they? They were invasions. They were conquering. We have no record of anything really that happened before the Romans, invaded. But I would guess that the numerous tribal groups that were involved in the British Isles before the Romans arrived were also they themselves involved in some, let's say, intergroup conflict. Then, following the Roman invasion, was the Anglo-Saxon invasion. And then following that, the Danish invasion. And finally, the Norman invasion. Well, let's think. Is there anything in common between all of these so-called migratory periods? Maybe that they weren't quite consensual. They weren't just happy, peaceful periods of, oh, we're coming in now. No, they were invasions. They were not the peaceful periods of movement across human history, such as being presented here now, are they? And thus, to conflate the current immigration of thousands of third world migrants into the United Kingdom being not only allowed for, but encouraged by the current government. Is that really the same thing as the historic colonization, conquering, or invasion of these foreign groups? But, it surely makes sense why people might react in a similar fashion to those, historical invasions, now doesn't it? Because it sure seems like it has a little bit more in common with the invasion terminology than the peaceful migrant terminology, now doesn't it? And we'll get into that. We are talking about massive changes in the population, and along with that, the culture and the environment of the country in which they exist. To say nothing of the economy, which again we can get into. But hang on, according to this video, the UK is not predominantly British? What?
Think immigration's a recent thing. Think again. Because you see, you've got the Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings, the North.
So surely there's no real major cultural or population shift happening here, right? It states that only 36% of British people are really British. Well, that's a rather questionable statement. So let's see where it comes from. Look, just saying, lads, you can't start stating statistics at me and not have me go and look up where they came from. Well, it apparently comes from this Ancestry.com article that looked at the genetic makeup of the average British citizen and found that, taken at random from a sample, any random Brit surveyed is 36.94% British, by that meaning Anglo-Saxon. They are also 21.59% Irish or Celtic, 19.91% Western European, 9.20% Scandinavian, 3.05% Iberian, and 1.98% Italian or Greek. Wowee! Does that in any way indicate that Britain is only 36%, quote, British? Oh, and just as a note, generally speaking, my lads who made this video, we round up on the decimal place. If it's a 0.5 or above, we round up. Just as a tip to you, BBC.
Just the tip? Just the tip!
Well, no, my dear friends. Let me just tell you, these data do not indicate that Britain is 36% British. In fact, what it indicates is that any resident of the United Kingdom is, on average, 36% Anglo-Saxon. But what about all of those other ethnicities, right? Weird. When I start to think about it, they all line up with the historical invasions and conquering peoples who were described above. Italians as in the Romans, Scandinavians as in the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swedish, Western Europeans as in the Normans, and what they call British in the Anglo-Saxons, and then in the ancient Celtic population that inhabited the Isles, which, considering the Celts and the Beaker people did exist in the Iberian Peninsula, could also explain some of that Iberian percentage, even though some of it could have been, foreign inhabitants as well. In other words, Nigel today, the average Nige, is more or less the same as he has been for the last 800 years. Nothing about these data from Ancestry.com indicates that only 36% of UK citizens are, quote, British or more in ancestry. More accurately, that they are Anglo-Saxons, which is what they're actually claiming here. The data only indicate that, taken at random, any person on the street of London, well, maybe not London, let's not use that as an example. How about Exeter? The random lad that you take off the street. He's about 36% to 37% Anglo-Saxon, about 22% Irish, 20% French or German, 9% Scandinavian, 3% Iberian, and 2% Italian. That totals 93% of his genetic makeup, which we would colloquially call British. And oh hey, conveniently, that is also the precise percentage of white population of Exeter, the city I picked. Wonder why I picked it. So no, the UK is not 36% British as this video claims. And be aware again, this is an educational video designed to be played for teenagers in British classrooms in high school that has, right now, as we've seen friends, outright lied about statistical source. But we're not done yet. While I am going to cover this so-called debate in and of itself, I think it's important that we first address the other most blatant piece of bullshit that is supposedly occurring in this so-called educational video. And that is the statistic, claiming that migrants contribute 34% more in taxes than they take in government benefits. Now, guys, I looked around for the citation used here, which only says UCL 2016. I was not able to find such a report. However, I was able to find a frequently cited UCL report from 2014, which I believe is the actual citation, and there are a number of things to note in that. I have searched extensively for a 2016 UCL report at length, and I cannot find an updated one that exists, checking both UCL and the CREAM research databases and centers. It just doesn't exist as far as I can tell. Again, maybe another indication of the academic rigor of this supposedly educational video, and look, if it was a YouTube video, I would expect some shit like this, but no, this is the BBC. Maybe if you put a link in your extensive description, because your description is, fairly in-depth, I would know what I'm talking about, but this is all you give me, UCL 2016. I couldn't find UCL 2016, so I found UCL 2014. And I think it's a little damning for you. It's not going to make you look good when I go into what this actually said. First of all, this report was predominantly and primarily concerned with immigration from Eastern European countries and was released following the addition of several Eastern European countries to the European Union. Now, of all of the other statistics cited in this video that concern the, concern of UK citizens with immigration to their country, I think the majority of that concern is focused on third world immigration of people from Somalia rather than Poles and Bulgarians. But even then, there is certainly some issue to be had with immigration from these Eastern European countries and immigration in general, right? Of that, let's still look at the potential errors that we have here. This study found that Eastern Europeans contributed 12% more to the economy in taxes than they received in benefits. Seems to line up with what they're stating in the video, right? That they're contributing more to the economy in taxes than they receive in benefits. Once again, this is still not even saying anything about non-EU arrivals yet. Let's just look at the Eastern Europeans. The UCL source states that Eastern European migrants contributed £3 billion to the British economy, while costing only £0.5 billion to the infrastructure. However, I've seen a little bit of a conflicting report on those numbers. as Migration Watch, a site that looks at these data in detail from various different research outlets and compares and contrasts them, indicates instead that there was in fact a significant loss by the own UCL's report, in the nature of between 1.3 and 1.5 billion pounds to the economy from Eastern European migrants alone. However, you get at that 0.5 billion number when one accounts only for income tax and national insurance, in contrast to payments of child benefits and tax credits. In other words, that 3 billion versus 0.5 billion is conflating numbers in various ways. First of all, that it does not just only include Eastern Europeans, it includes all EU migration, and secondly, that it's only looking at national insurance and income tax, in contrast to child benefit payouts and tax credits. It does not in any way include the massive costs of public services in this estimation of 0.5 billion, such as the cost of healthcare, NHS. This cost, again, is seemingly balanced out by migrants from other European countries, who contribute somewhere in the realm of 1.4 and 2.8 billion pounds, according to these very same UCL data. But again, when Brits and other UK citizens express concern over immigration to their countries, particularly in the wake of abhorrent violence from migrants and the children of migrants, actually it seems to be predominantly first-generation children who have committed some of the atrocities we've seen, such as the London Bridge attack and the Manchester bombing. Are they Poles and Bulgarians that you think they're worried about in the wake of these attacks? Or are they people from third world countries who all have something a little bit in common with one another, that they share a particular faith? People who belong to a religion that outright calls for the subjugation and conquer of all the world, of all of the kafir, the non-believers. I'm just saying, I'd put my money on the latter, on Muhammad, rather than the polar. Shit, that's a terrible line, please kill me. But anyway, we're still only talking about EU migration. Thus, let's move forward and look at the data from these studies that account for non-EU migrants. Looking at the data on the economic impact of non-EU migrants from this 2014 report, the report that I believe is being cited in the video, indicates a £3.8 billion net loss with all migration in total, resulting in a loss of between 13 and 17 billion pounds to the British economy. Further, Migration Watch reported that the financial increases the UK has experienced over the last 2 decades from immigration were generally even in decline over the past 3 years, even back so far as the 2014 UCL report. Even then, 4 years ago, the general benefits of immigration were starting to be seen as a temporary patch, a temporary band-aid, and not an ultimate boon to society. Could it be because of the breakdown in immigration becoming more and more non-EU in origin? Maybe. The point is, when you account for all migration from the EU to the UK, yes, we probably do find that migrants contribute more than they cost. But then, you have to look at it again only when you don't include the overall cost to the nation, such as the use of NHS, as this report cited excludes. But when we look at all of these information and data in aggregate, even the report the video utilizes itself ultimately concludes a net loss of over 10 billion pounds a year in the cost of supporting migration to the nation. And you wonder why people might be a little bit upset. You keep citing statistics that show that they're upset. Well, maybe if you cited the source correctly, your students you're attempting to shill this to would understand why they're upset. Beyond just racism and right-wing movements. Well, no, they're moving to the right because they are upset, and they're upset because of the damage to the economy. Hang on, isn't immigration good for the economy? Isn't it good for the country? I mean, this video doesn't get into it in too much detail. They just kind of toss out a number taken out of context. Not only taken out of context, but one which does not describe the actual cost of mass immigration. But the panel does insist that immigration is beneficial and great for the nation at large.
The history of any country would be very unexciting if you got rid of immigration. God, the Premier League would be boring if there wasn't immigration.
Thank you. Oh
Half my
goodness.
favourite players all from different countries.
And to respond, in short, I would direct you to Australia's similar economic boom that they have experienced as they have welcomed tens of thousands of migrant workers, with a 1.7 increase in total population over the last decade. Well, I'm no economist, that's for sure, but it's really not that complicated now, is it? More people, more money being moved around, and therefore an artificial inflation of the GDP. At the same time, more people means more competition for both goods and jobs and services. As such, the cost of housing in cities like Sydney and Melbourne have skyrocketed, as has the cost of products and services, particularly those that are in high demand. In contrast, lower wages given the growing workforce and less necessity for employers to find employees. Well, there's plenty of them now, right? Thus, we've seen a fairly similar trend in Australia that we've seen in the UK. We saw the economy go up as migration went up, But when you start to look at it, even though it's in decline now, when you start to look at the actual life satisfaction, the amount of money people are earning, it's not, again, so simple. Thus, while yes, we often find the importation of migrants actually does increase GDP, such things, again, can't be boiled down to such a simple unit of measurement to be examined in macro. Another reason why a short 5-minute video such as this one, which quickly flashes statistics on the screen that are not explained, and as we have seen, are not accurate without explication, is not really appropriate to just send out to children and expect them to understand the complexities of this. Because while Australia's economy is booming on the outside, when you look at the inside, it's not the massive economic boom that you might see if you didn't look at it a little bit closer. You have to go actually look at how people's lives are being affected, not just a simple number. And I know that's coming from me. So let's get into the other parts of the video that I think are somewhat relevant to discuss, and there's not much left. Again, it's 5 minutes. So first of all, I can't really go forward without noting kind of the obvious, that it looks like not a single member of this panel is white. Well, I mean, maybe this girl is, I'm not totally sure, nor do I want to get into some so-and-so isn't white shit.
We're finally gonna have an answer to what is white. What is white? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more.
Point is, the 2011 census data from the UK indicate that the country is 87% white, with 7% being Asian, including Indians and Pakistani people, 3% being black, and 2% being mixed. Yet here we have a panel which is overwhelmingly not representative of the majority of British society, which is, well, still white. I know that since 2011, that 87% has likely dropped significantly since the time these data were collected, but it still seems a bit interesting to me that a panel about immigration and populations outside of those that have been native to the UK since about 1200 AD is comprised entirely, or pretty much entirely, of much more recent black, mixed, and Asian immigrants to the nation. But let's look at some of the things they have to say, because who they are and what they look like, while potentially of some interest at the topic in hand, ultimately doesn't matter. It's what they're saying.
I mean, like, I'm drinking our national drink. That is tea. Tea. Where do you get that from?
China.
China, I would have said, yeah.
okay.
All the tea in China. India's probably a good one to look at as well, with Vindaloo being the England song. Grime is thriving right now, and grime would not exist without immigration.
This guy brings up that tea, England's national drink, was imported from nations like China and India, and that's correct. It was a product that was imported from China, although it should be noted that India was conquered by the British colonial empire. Again, we're bringing back that colonization, that invasion shit that I mentioned above. The cross-contamination of cultures, this multiculturalism, it usually hasn't been the peaceful, wonderful thing you're espousing here.
Multiculturalism is a powerful tool for survival.
Yeah.
And possibly the only way to survive. So let's embrace it.
Because generally speaking, cultures mix for unpleasant reasons. But the point is, this is a common argument that because we import goods and products, there's no reason we shouldn't just engage in importing people too, right? I mean, what would we do if we didn't have unrestrained chain migration from Mexican people in this country? I mean, we wouldn't be able to get a burrito anywhere. That's just a silly and stupid argument.
You have to take out every reference to Tex-Mex in this book. And I said, why? And they said, well, it has vile connotations. And I was kind of struck because I thought, wow, this is what we have eaten in our household for generations. You know, this is who we are. And I never thought of us as vile. Wow.
Well, as I've discussed above, yes, immigration can boost the economy. Unrestrained immigration, probably not so much. Importing goods is not the same thing as importing people. Outside of that, I would say the video is more or less fair in describing the rise of right-wing movements in the UK as being a response in part to immigration. But their conclusions, they're just absurd leftist bunk. What is their solution to immigration affecting the economy, even though they kind of claim that it doesn't, or that it's a net boon? But then they see that people are upset about it, so how do we answer that question? Well, let's take a listen.
Rather than the anger being directed at a movement of people who are just seeking opportunities and experiences, it should be directed at our government to ask them why they aren't putting money into our NHS, our education system, our housing system.
Oh, Oh, that's right, of course. Imagine my shock. I know what will fix any problems with the economy. More government spending. Oh, there's too much government spending. You know how to fix that? Spend more money. Immigration is costing the country jobs and cash. Well, might as well just drop more cash into the old cash mill. That'll fix it. I mean, holy gods, lads. I have no idea how to describe what I just heard here. I mean, maybe someone can explain what I'm missing here, but I just don't think that's going to be a very effective use of your cash. I think you're just throwing money into the wind. But why am I talking about this beyond the fact that I hate seeing misinformation passed around as fact, particularly when it comes to pedagogy and the education of children? Well, because this video somewhat heinously redefines history of invasion and conquers as migration, similar to what the UK government currently allows. Just pretty much let them all in. Doesn't matter if they went and joined ISIS, doesn't matter if they went to Syria to fight. Oh, you can just come back and move right back into your flat in London. We're not going to vet anything. Thanks, Sadiq Khan.
We just let you calmly come back in. Only one of them is currently under one of these control
and yet
orders.
400 have come back out of the 850 who've gone to Iraq or Syria to fight. How do we know how many? I mean, obviously this is a UK problem. You are mayor of the capital city where the most recent terrorist attack has taken place. How many of those 400 have come back to London?
The estimate is just over half.
This matters because the problem is in the conflation and redefinition of terms, that it actually can have some potential impact on individuals and on society at large when we talk about massive alteration of language. As such, we need to discuss the effect of language on beliefs, attitudes, and ultimately behavior. First, we should begin by establishing a few terms, namely connotation versus denotation. And I don't mean to insult your intelligence, my friends, as I'm sure most of you know the difference between these two things, but let's just quickly cover them. The denotation of a word is its dictionary definition, while the connotation are the thoughts and emotions that are associated with a word or a phrase. So in this instance, we're looking at words like invasion being eradicated in favor of words like immigration or migration. So let's take a look at the dictionary definitions of these terms. The definition of invasion from Google is as follows. Well, there's multiple definitions. An instance of invading a country or region with an armed force, an incursion by a large number of people or things into a place or sphere of activity, or an unwelcome intrusion into another's domain. Sounded pretty negative there. Unwanted intrusion. In contrast, the Google definition of immigration is simply the action of coming to live permanently in a foreign country. Quickly, we can discern a difference in the connotations of these words beyond just the difference in the actual words being used to describe a word, the denotations, with a significant negative and violent connotation associated with words like invasion that is not associated with words like immigration. Hence, when videos like this refer to the historical invasions and conquerings of the British Isles as immigration, they remove this negative connotation and instead reframe it as just a positive and peaceful movement of peoples. But why does it matter how we use language when explaining history such as this to students? Well, in part because our interpretation of reality is based on the use of language. If we redefine historical invasions in contexts such as this, and thankfully I would say the left is generally inconsistent as fuck when it comes to messages such as this one, often portraying the British and the US as, the historically evil oppressors and colonialists, so there's probably not too much to worry about here. I don't think they can maintain a consistent narrative, but still it is of interest to understand the intent behind videos like this. That is to change perceptions of reality by using linguistics. Oh no, the British Isles weren't invaded by multiple different groups of people over time. They just peacefully migrated there. That's why only 36% of UK citizens are actually British, right? Do you see the intent of changing reality based on careful changing of a single symbol or word, such as invasion to immigration? We found this pretty similarly in the US recently. Look at Donald Trump's recent statements on MS-13. He called them animals. Well, you know what MS-13 does? It's animal-like behavior. Let's just look at a few of them. Pimp ordered baseball bat beating of underage prostitute. Gang beheaded victim cut out his heart, say Maryland police. Gang members beat, stab New York teen girl to death. Gang members beat Maryland woman to death. See you in hell, convicted female MS-13 gang member told victim. 4 New York teens brutally beaten to death by MS-13 gang. MS-13 woman laughed as murder victim was stabbed 153 times, say prosecutors. MS-13 gang leader murdered 14-year-old Texas boy with a machete. MS-13 members charged with machete attack in US. MS-13 attempt to kidnap, murder 16-year-old boy. And the last one, MS-13 orders murder of a teen after a Facebook photo post. Yeah, they're fucking animals. But what have we seen in the media? Oh, they're not animals. How dare Donald Trump refer to these gang members, which they are, violent gang members, as animals? Do they call them gang members? No, they do not.
When the President of the United States says about undocumented immigrants, these aren't people, these are animals, you have to wonder, does he not believe in the spark of divinity, the dignity and worth of every person?
No, hold on. I think I just realized the MS in MS-13 stands for misunderstood.
They call them undocumented migrants, refugees. They're just innocent people who are seeking a new life in America, just like our grandparents, huh? Maybe your grandparents, Chuck, but not mine.
My ancestors are smiling at me, Imperials. Can you say the same?
Si serás imbécil, Jacinto. Todos mis antepasados son judíos. ¿Ah, sí? Pues mira lo que tengo. ¡Heil Hitler!
My point is, we see this a lot, using language in order to try to change reality. But does it actually work? Well, the short answer, yeah, it kind of does, a little bit. For example, Adler et al., 1995, found that more common names such as Mary or Hank were preferred by participants over less common names such as Percival or Isidore. Things that we are more used to hearing are more preferred to our ears, more or less, and that makes sense on how our mental schema and cognitive heuristics work. The more we hear something, the more we kind of like it because the more used we are to hearing it.
They're not funny.
It's funny and people love them.
It's just references. Who's getting these references?
A lot of people are. Everybody gets, when you hear something you've heard before, that's comedy.
No, that's not comedy.
We become comfortable with things over time. We just prefer the known over the unknown. The more you hear something, the more likely you are to default to it. This is a process called conventionalization, and it is the process through which repetition of a word or symbol becomes a cultural norm. This is obviously the purpose of all of this language altering, right? If I replace the word invasion with immigration, well then things will change. Immigration becomes the more comfortable word. If I replace the word gang member with undocumented migrant, well, it totally changes the connotation of this entire conversation now, doesn't it? Again, we're lucky that the left so often lacks the consistency to implement such an attempt at a large scale, but they do attempt it. Further, and along the same lines as Adler et al., Strasser conducted sort of just a general questioning among her friends and looking online on various websites such as Hot or Not, an informal, non-academic poll, and found that people rated the attractiveness of the now more or less defunct website of people who were hotter to have more common names, like Henry or John, rather than, again, Percival or Isidore. Again, indicating how language affects how we prefer things, such that the more we hear something, the more familiar it is, therefore the more we like it. Howard 1997 provided additional support for this idea with his examination of argument repetition and found that people who were distracted in accordance with the elaboration likelihood model that I've discussed before at length, which defines the way that we process information into central, direct route processing, or peripheral route processing when we're distracted, we're being drawn away by the shiny object. Well, when we are distracted, we're a bit more likely to be persuaded by a word or a phrase if we have heard it before, according to Howard 1997, illustrating again the importance and potential impact of language, not just in our attitude, but potentially on persuasion towards a belief or attitude. So, we see that hearing a word more often makes it a little bit more accessible to our brains. That makes sense. But what potential outcome and impact does this have on the way that we process information? Beyond just liking something. Well, it actually may change the way that we perceive reality. The concept that language affects our perceptions of the world is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it's been one of the most discussed and highly debated topics in the fields of communication and linguistics over the last half a century, including its very heavy criticism by the likes of, for example, Noam Chomsky, with the seminal research being Sapir 1949 and Whorf 1956. The basic concept proposed initially by Sapir is that we can only understand the world based on the language that we have with which to describe it, which Whorf later expanded upon after Sapir's death with the concept of Weltanschauung, I believe, sorry if I fucked that up, or worldview, furthering the proposal of Sapir, that if we don't have the words to describe a thing, it doesn't exist in our minds.
You know, I was doing some reading about this idea that if you immerse yourself into a foreign language, that you can actually rewire your brain.
Yeah, Sapir-Whorf. hypothesis. The theory that it's the theory that the language you speak determines how you think, and
Yeah, it affects how you see everything.
For example, certain native Alaskan peoples have many different words to describe snow, and according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, therefore these peoples understand snow at a potentially more complex level than native English speakers, given that we only have a few general words for snow or ice or sleet. In order to study this theory, various researchers have examined how language affects perception, such as Kay and Kempton, 1984, who examined the differences in perceptions of color between English speakers and the Tarahumara people, the indigenous peoples of Chihuahua, Mexico, who use a single word to define the colors both blue and green. We obviously distinguish blue, green as most basic terms that we have to describe what we see of as different colors, but the Tarahumara people have only one word for both of these colors. English speakers were able to determine a difference between different shades of blue and green fairly quickly, while the Tarahumara speakers viewed the same series of colors that English speakers saw as disparate as pretty much identical, as more or less the same color. In other words, if you don't have the vocabulary to describe something, you might not even perceive of its existence. You might not be able to understand a thing if the words have been erased or have never existed in your linguistic lexicon. The researchers described this phenomena as the naming strategy of understanding. Similarly, and later, Winoward 2007 found that while it doesn't affect perceptions themselves, vocabulary may affect processing speed, as Russian speakers who possess unique words for light blue and dark blue as parts of their common speech, which, as I mentioned above, is more accessible, in such that the average English speaker is likely less aware of more specific words that our language does possess for words of light and dark blue like periwinkle or navy. In comparison, the Russian language lacks a basic generic term for blue. Instead, they differentiate into these light and dark shades. Goluboy and Sini. Again, sorry if I mispronounced that. So this made for an interesting contrast between the two languages and how we process looking at the color blue differently. As such, was it any real surprise there? Russian speakers were faster at discriminating the difference between light blues and dark blues than English speakers were. They could tell the differences quicker. Further, Tan et al. 2008 used fMRI equipment to see how the brain responds differently to colors for which we possess a simple or a complex word in order to describe, with simple being something like, again, blue, and complex being something like beige. I mean, you describe what these colors are to me. And found that even without using words, so just showing people images of the colors and allowing their brains to process them and then looking at that processing with the fMRI, it took participants longer to determine the difference in colors that were more difficult to name. The difficult versus easy to name colors also activated similar regions of the brain, but they activated them to different degrees. In other words, yes, on some level. At this point, we really cannot totally deny the existence of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that our lexicon does in some way affect our perception of reality. It at least affects how quickly we can respond to things. The initial proposal that we can't conceive of things we lack a word for does not appear to be accurate, meaning of course we can learn new words and adapt to understand new phenomena, but we do tend to go towards the familiar more quickly, which is no surprise from a cognitive processing stance. Of course, we're cognitive misers, we want to go with the easy route. But what this means is that when you normalize something through language, you try to alter the way that we speak, then you also alter the way that we think. And I raise this all because it indicates that over time, the common use of language can potentially change our collective perceptions of what is reality, if only on a minor level. While the denotation may remain the same, by changing the words being used in their frequency, now the connotation of the message is altered. This is particularly of interest when the connotations of word carry significant meaning, such as words like animal and gang and invasion or immigrant. Weaver, 1953, in his Ethics of Rhetoric, described that linguistic connotations can be generally categorized into God terms and devil terms. God terms would include words like fact, progress, fairness, or even skepticism. Damn. While devil terms include words like racist, Nazi, extremist. Well, I would say communist, but I don't think that's true anymore. It was when Weaver did his 1953 research.
Die, you commie fucker!
Rhetoricians, according to Weaver, though, should embrace both types of terms when attempting to persuade others to their point of view, using God terms to describe their own side and using devil terms to describe the opposition. We see this all the time. It's the nature of rhetoric, right? Thus, if I'm trying to depict immigration as beneficial, it would make sense for me to avoid the use of words like conqueror or invasion to describe the historical movement of populations to the British Isles, as those are devil terms, and instead use more neutral terminology, like immigration or migration, or undocumented migrant, undocumented person. Foss and Trepp, 1985, added an additional category to Weaver's dichotomy of terminology, that being charismatic terms, which they described as words like freedom or democracy, which are attractive, but only attractive in certain circumstances. Some people, again, going back to that communist thing, aren't gonna like you talking about freedom and democracy too much.
At some point, this becomes hate speech. At some point, inciting a riot flies. It's called free speech. No, it's called you communist faggot.
Given the context of this video in particular, which for example uses the term multiculturalism as a sort of God term, of how great multiculturalism is. I mean, if we didn't have multiculturalism, guys, we wouldn't have tea. We could easily see that as either a charismatic term or a God term in nature, and therefore potentially persuasive to the viewer and useful in the formation of a worldview based on language. But here's of course the thing that always really bothers me with shit like this. Who is the population that this video is directed at? Young people who have spent their time in school, probably seen a lot of videos like this one, thus potentially invoking reinforcement theory, which posits that information is more persuasive when it confirms and conforms to our already established beliefs. Again, language being used to change perceptions of reality. If you hear it over and over again, it becomes more normative. And we like things that are normative. We're more persuaded by things that we've heard before. Finally, as Burgoon and Siegel 2004 explicated in their language expectancy theory, highly credible sources, such as the BBC surely is for most of these students being exposed to this kind of crap, are more persuasive and actually have more leeway in their attempts at persuasion, given the expectation that their messages are similarly credible. What that means is that the BBC could actually say some insane shit, but oh, it's the BBC, so they must be right, right? In other words, the BBC is using a precise and careful manipulation of terms that are charismatic or at least non-devilish in nature to describe a trend, and given their credibility and the reinforcement of ideas that are already being spread en masse both socially and through the media, thereby going back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, we have the potential for the alteration of language and meaning of terms to ultimately alter and affect the perception of reality from these students chronically exposed to these kinds of content and narratives. But what's the problem with using inaccurate language, Aiden? I mean, beyond just the capacity to essentially indoctrinate people. Well, when you're not clear in the meaning behind what you say, it often means the message that you convey are not properly understood by the receiver. Essentially, it leaves the person high and dry, allowing him or her to fill in the blanks, and I find videos like this leave a lot of blanks to be filled, either in the quickly flashed and miscited statistics, or their misuse of terms like migration or multiculturalism to refer to historic invasions. And you know, maybe that's why you get a lot of people who are very persuaded by left-leaning messages, but when you start to get into the meat of it and ask them questions about it, they can't explain why they think the things they think, or explain their outrage, because they have had to fill in the gaps through missing and unclear information. But, you know, it actually might be good in the long run, for as Chapman, Abrahams, Jenkins, and Fallowfield 2003 found, participants in a study concerned with medicinal outcomes who did not understand the diagnosis that their doctors were trying to relate to them were less likely to follow the instructions given to them by said physicians, indicating again the importance of clarity on behaviors beyond just attitudes. In other words, conflating terms and history like this might actually be potentially long-term detrimental to their message and attempts at persuasion. Further along that same line of thinking, we can look to the findings of Seiter, Larson, and Skinner 1988, who found that people who were exposed to description of disabled people responded differently based on the type of language used to describe the disabled person. Namely that the people who were described as heroic, normal, or disabled, who were all disabled, garnered more compassion from participants, rather than people who were described of as pathetic. However, when it came to expressed willingness of participants to assist this disabled person, they were more sympathetic and more willing to help the person who was described of as pathetic and helpless. Now, we hear that kind of shit all the time. Pathetic and helpless, And it works. People are more willing to help the pathetic. In other words, if you want people to feel bad for immigrants, describing them in these pathetic terms is probably more useful for attaining any kind of goal towards garnering greater actual support for them in the long run than describing them in these more kind of heroic language. In contrast, describing all native British people under the umbrella of migrants and multiculturalism potentially increases the acceptance of white people in the long run, in the opposite effect. And I'm pretty sure that your goal was totally the reverse of that, right? But hey, this is why trying to manipulate language to persuade is a tricky game. You can always end up shooting yourself in the foot. My point is pretty much that too. This video is a hideous attempt at propaganda, and more hideous than most in that it is aimed at teenagers and in a classroom environment that attempts to redefine terms like immigration in order to paint a very particular painting of reality, while using culturally charismatic terms like multiculti.
Diversity is the strength of the Republican Party.
Diversity is our strength.
Our diversity is our strength.
Diversity is our strength.
Because diversity is our strength.
Diversity is our strength.
Diversity, which is our strength.
Our diversity is our strength.
Diversity is our strength.
In association with positive narratives to reinforce the message of the supposed historic immigration and friendly nature of the British Isles. This is dangerous because of how we know language affects how we perceive reality as per the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, not only in our perceptions and attitudes towards objects or topics, but potentially our behaviors and actions. It affects the way our brains work. Thereby, there is real potential danger in redefining terms, particularly over time and at a cultural or societal level, such as invasion to immigration, such as gang member into undocumented migrant. By relying on these historical inaccuracies and misrepresenting violent history and violent current history as one of peaceful migration, as one of these people just trying to make a life for themselves in the United States. Yeah, we should respect that. What are you doing calling them animals? How dare you, Donald Trump? How dare you refer to this as an invasion? In the long run, if those ideas are perpetuated over and over, it can change the way we view the past. People apparently really don't like this phrase, but history is written by the victors in a lot of ways, okay? And there's no better way to illustrate that than looking at the power of language. Look at words like slave. Now, Kanye West tried to say this, albeit very ineloquently, but he was trying to say, and one of the many things people got angry with him about, was that the word slave has a definitive connotation around black people, and that's true.
It's like we're mentally in prison. I like the word prison because slavery goes too direct to the idea of blacks. It's like slavery, Holocaust Jews, slavery is blacks. So prison is something that unites us as one race.
And that's because the word has become so ingrained over long-term use. The associated meanings with it in our cognitive heuristics are very tight, of slave equals black person, despite the fact that pretty much all people have been enslaved at one point or another during the long course of human history. And in contrast, the natural British multiculturalism being touted in this video, that was not a benign one as they are attempting to redefine, but one that was arrived at after thousands of years of conflict, given that groups kind of tend to inherently conflict with each other when they're trying to inhabit the same space. Other misuse of language similarly allows reality to potentially be molded in the minds of listeners, given this kind of subtle persuasion technique. Well, as I said, I do not think this is overwhelmingly anything to be concerned with, particularly in the form of a single poorly sourced video such as this. But the problem's not about a single poorly sourced video now, is it? The problem is, as I have described above, with making something mainstream, with conventionalizing it. When it's normalized, when it becomes so repeated that it becomes that which is most accessible, that's where it's dangerous at a societal level, and I do think we're getting there. But also, as I said, the other reason not to necessarily fret too much is the seeming inability of much of the left to maintain consistent narratives on things like this. I mean, one day the Brits are vile colonialists that all need to die out, and no, not today, no, they were just a period of peaceful migration of everyone. Britain has always been multicultural, right?
Morning, Pakenham.
Just depends on what kind of goal you're looking for, I suppose. Really, in the long run, although I did want to talk about language, I mostly just wanted to bitch about this shitty video, because whenever I see propaganda being aimed at kids, oh, that really boils my bottom, lads. But hopefully we've also learned some interesting things about how language can affect our perceptions of reality. And it is interesting that how we speak, ultimately, can affect on some little level the way we see the world. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Untitled.